Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me out here. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming. I know this looks like a lovely community. And thanks to each and every one of you for being here and for what you do, because I know everybody in this room does. Is that, I could take them, you know, it might be easier. Can I take this out?
You can if you want, yeah.
No, okay, that'll be easier. Okay. Anyway, thank you for coming. You know, I get invited to speak a fair amount, and I often show this video because I like to situate everyone in the reality of what is going on in Ecuador. So I can sort of explain, it sort of helps, I think, to understand the work that I did personally, as well as my colleagues, other lawyers, and community leaders to win what has turned out to be a landmark pollution case. These communities that got affected by this pollution worked with lawyers like me and teams of people over many years to win the largest monetary judgment against an oil company won by indigenous peoples in a court of law in the history of the world. And it's amazing. And we're really proud of that. That said, the battle continues, and I want to talk a little bit about the modality that Chevron used in complicity with various law firms and our court system in the United States to try to destroy this historic accomplishment of these indigenous peoples. And this effort, orchestrated by them, was targeted largely against me personally, me and my family. I have a wife and a son who's now a sophomore in college. And it was designed to really blow up the concept that you could do a case like this. You know, they not only wanted to win the case, they wanted to kill off the idea that you could do a case like this. And one of the main ways they tried to do that, again, was to target certain individuals. And before I get into some of the details, I want to say that I think what happened to me, and I was detained for almost 3 years on a misdemeanor contempt of court charge. I'm the only lawyer that I know of in the country ever detained in prison or at home. Most of my detention was at home detention with an ankle bracelet on such a charge. It's never happened before. And there's like a lot of firsts in this case, and what I really learned over the course of dealing with what happened to me after the communities won the judgment is that our legal system is very malleable and subject to manipulation. Now, I know that might be very evident now in light of what's happening in this country, and especially since January 20th. But when it happened to me, it wasn't that evident to most people how this system could be used by a corporation to really run roughshod over the rule of law and run roughshod over the norms that one would expect to see in a legal system in order to, in my opinion, corruptly help an oil company escape liability for poisoning the Amazon and decimating indigenous groups down there, and in the process killing a lot of people. I just want to emphasize that. What was in this video is still there. People are still hurting, people are still suffering, and people are still getting disease, including cancers, and many are dying without medical care. Because Texaco, in the 1960s and 1970s, took it upon itself to decide that it had a right to build a system of oil extraction that would deliberately pollute this delicate, beautiful ecosystem so it could increase its profits. It made that decision. which resulted when I first went down there, and you saw some pictures of me as a young man. That was my very first trip to Ecuador way back in 1993, before I know at least some of you were born. The people there did not choose to have to deal with this. They were never consulted. The oil was under their land that they had lived on for millennia. And in a few short years, Texaco cut a deal with Ecuador's government of the time without consulting these communities to go into their territories and drill violently into the ground thousands of feet and extract massive amounts of oil and take the waste byproduct. A lot of you probably don't know much about oil production, but I'll tell you, I had to learn a little bit about it doing this case. When a barrel of oil comes out of the ground, at least the equivalent of waste comes out of the ground with heavy metals and benzene and cancer-causing toxins, and you got to put that somewhere. And the normal practice is to re-inject it thousands of feet underground through other well cavities. But in Ecuador, Texaco decided to just run it off into rivers and streams. The same rivers and streams that the people in this area, thousands of people in this area, had relied on for their drinking water, for their bathing, and their fishing. This was a deliberate act. We call it ecocide. Ecocide, by the way, is a new legal concept that many around the world are trying to get accepted as customary, as law. It's sort of the environmental equivalent of genocide, whereas you so destroy the environment and you're so wanton and reckless about it that you know peoples are going to die as a result, in this case, indigenous peoples. This is a massive crime, in my opinion. And I spent a lot of years working on this case. I worked on other cases. I graduated, by the way, from law school in 1991 in the same class as Barack Obama. He was my classmate. Neil Gorsuch, who's on the US Supreme Court, was also in our class. I could not have had a more privileged kind of educational background as a lawyer. And I was really honored and enthusiastic about taking my legal skill, limited as it was 1 year out of law school, and like taking it down to this part of the world and seeing if we could pull something together to hold this company accountable for this massive problem. I had no idea at the time it would last this long. My first trip was 32 years ago, and we're still doing this. Now, if you look at the course of legal history or the desegregation and all sorts of stuff in this country, it's actually not that long. Like, it takes decades to create meaningful, significant, even paradigmatic legal change through the courts. So it's not surprising to me, although I never at the time expected it to last this long. It seemed so obvious they had done something wrong. Like, how could it last this long? And what I really learned, which was part of my education as an advocate and as a lawyer that I never learned in law school. They don't teach this stuff in law school. They don't want young lawyers to know how to do these cases. You know, law schools don't exist to train lawyers and to take on corporate America. That's not what they do. You know, there are some, a fair number of people come out of law school who do that, but it's almost by accident, or you got to go find it, you know. Law schools don't train Ralph Nader types, okay? They train the types of lawyers I was going up against in this case. And what ended up happening, just to sort of fill in the blanks from the video, is after we won the case in 2011, Chevron sued me here in New York in the very court that we had filed the original environmental case in, right in Manhattan. The same court that they got the case dismissed from because they didn't want to litigate the case in New York. They got it dismissed to Ecuador. When we won in Ecuador, they came back to that court that was never good enough to sue me for $60 billion. I got sued for more money than anyone in the history of this country. Okay, $60 billion. And when that happened, when they sued me under a civil law called RICO, you probably heard of it. It's a racketeering law that Trump is talking about now using against progressives, is using. Who's that? Cop City, well, that's a state case, but yes, it's being used to target progressive activists, okay? It was shocking to me. Apologies for being shocked, but maybe I was a little naive. But having gotten out of Harvard Law School with the guy who was then president of the United States, I did not think my opponent in a civil lawsuit could use a criminal statute, essentially what it is, to try to criminalize me, to really create a narrative to turn me and my colleagues into criminals, to sort of flip the script, right? They had gone down there and poisoned thousands of people, and they tried to flip the script to say that they were victims of us, of our greed. Their theory was that the whole case was a sham and we were trying to extort them for money. I mean, particularly the plaintiffs' lawyers in the United States, me and other lawyers, were trying to make our legal fee by ripping them off, basically. That was their false narrative that they tried to sell to the media, to the public, because they were really embarrassed, right? Like they basically, you know, a bunch of indigenous communities, I mean, all respect to them because these are very sophisticated communities, but not in the Western sense that we understand in US courts. These are very sophisticated people. And they were humiliated to lose this case. And when they sued me, it wasn't like a normal litigation. I sensed quite a bit of emotional anger from the Chevron lawyers and from the Chevron executives. And I realized that when on the eve of my RICO trial, where I had to these lawsuits are designed to just distract you and intimidate you. Rather than me focusing on getting their money to force them to comply with this judgment that we won, I had to then turn my attention to protecting me and my family, and it was really difficult. And on the eve of trial, they dropped all the $60 billion of money damages claims to avoid a jury. Many of you might not know, some lawyers might know. But under our Constitution, the Seventh Amendment, does anyone know what the Seventh Amendment says? Okay. Don't worry, I didn't know it either until I had to deal with this issue. But the Seventh Amendment gives a person sued for money in a civil case the right to a jury trial. But if you don't get sued for money, theoretically you wouldn't get a jury, and they were so scared of a jury actually judging what had happened and seeing me and probably ruling in my favor that they dropped every penny of the $60 billion 2 weeks before the trial. So the judge could try the case alone, but the judge, it turns out, had significant investments in the oil and gas industry, including in Chevron. He was totally pro-corporate. He never disclosed this. We found this out on our own and confronted him with it. And to make a very long story short, they had a trial, quote unquote trial, which is more like a show trial, it was a farce. I knew we had no chance. And they paid a Ecuadorian man millions of dollars to come up here. They sort of created a private witness protection program. They got him asylum in the United States. And he testified that he was in a meeting where I approved a bribe of the trial judge in Ecuador. He just said this. And it's not true, just to be clear. I did not do that and would never do such a thing. But it turns out, because we got to depose this guy, that these Chevron lawyers at this big law firm called Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher had coached him for 53 days prior to his false testimony, which he later admitted under cross-examination was false to a great degree. So they basically took a non-jury civil racketeering case that had criminal overtones, paid a witness to testify falsely, and out of that they got this judgment from a judge who had investments in Chevron to issue a ruling that the whole case in Ecuador is a fraud, even though Ecuador's Supreme Court ruled unanimously to validate the judgment. And Canada's Supreme Court in 2015 also ruled unanimously to validate the judgment to the extent that the Ecuadorian communities would have a right to go try to seize Chevron's assets in Canada to force them to pay for the cleanup. And when we got that Canadian Supreme Court decision, I think they had had enough of me. I sort of got the sense they had like a ladder of pressure. You know, first they say, hey, you know, we're going to come after you. And then they take out a newspaper ad, you know, about you in the Ecuadorian press. And then they say bad things about you. They have a very powerful PR department. And then they sue you. And if you keep going, they keep going up the ladder. And I think that they reached the point where they felt they had so much risk from the work we were doing that they had to lock me up, corruptly lock me up. And the way they did that, by the way, there's the art of these, what are called SLAP lawsuits. You guys know what a SLAP lawsuit is? It stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. It's essentially a lawsuit that is designed by a powerful entity like a government or a corporation to silence an adversary by weaponizing the law. They don't really want to litigate the case and necessarily win. They want to use the procedure of the case, the burden of having to defend yourself, to so punish the person they will shut up, stop talking, or in my case, I would just quit and leave my clients in Ecuador defenseless, which I couldn't bring myself to do, even though in all honesty I was up against so much. I had to actually run that analysis through my head, like what would that look like? I have a wife and a son, okay, but I never did it for various personal reasons. And by the way, had I done that, I wouldn't really be that critical of myself. This was crazy land, okay? I did not sign up for this. So the art of these SLAP lawsuits is, even though they're illegitimate, they violate the First Amendment right to free speech. They're about weaponizing and manipulating the law. The art is to make them, while that process plays out, to make them look real, to hide what they're doing in the technicality of Rule 42 or some amendment or some statute, okay? And in my case, the way they did it is they, after they won the racketeering, the non-jury racketeering case, you know, and the judge issued this long opinion, they got the judge to order me to pay them millions of dollars to compensate them for their legal fees they used to persecute me. Money I did not have. I could not pay this money. They then went back to the judge after we won the Canadian decision, like 3 or 4 years later. This is their plan to lock me up. And they asked the judge to order me to give them my computer and confidential case file, which, as most of you probably know, there's something called attorney-client privilege. You can't give your adversary counsel your confidential information, confidential communications with your clients. That would violate the most sacrosanct protection that our profession has. They got the judge to order it anyway on the theory that I was a criminal, that I wasn't really a legitimate lawyer, based on his earlier decision. And I was very straight with the judge. And by the way, I'm walking into court, this federal court in Manhattan, with 30-foot ceilings and this gorgeous building, and this judge sitting up on the bench, and you know, Chevron would have 15, 20 lawyers in there, and I'd literally walk in alone and going up against these lawyers. By the way, not that I wanted to do that. If I had the resources, I would have had a legal team, you know, but I had to rely on myself and my legal training and my wits and my everything I could muster to like deal with these guys and women. And I never, luckily, I maintained my poise throughout. I knew what they most wanted from me was for me to go cuckoo and yell at them or yell at the judge. You know, even though I was being treated in the most unprofessional, unethical way, I always maintained my decorum and my professionalism, which drove them even more nuts about me. And ultimately, when I told the judge I would not be turning over my computer, and I asked him to hold me in contempt of court, which would allow me to appeal his, what I believe was an illegal order to violate attorney-client privilege, he held me in civil contempt. He tried to fine me, he issued a fine to fine me $2,000 a day, doubled every day and cumulative. I don't know if you guys are good at math, but I said, like, how quickly would that get to $1 billion? Like if you go 2,000, 4,000, 8,000, like it's really fast. It's like 2 or 3 months. Like you're at $1 billion. I'm like, and I realized this is the largest fine a judge has ever imposed on a person or a bank or a corporation in the history of the New York courts. It's like on me. So I pointed that out. The judge was like embarrassed. He then like lowered the fine, but I ended up owing them millions of dollars. And their theory was that they had a right to my computer to see if I was hiding money somewhere, like in some offshore bank account. But what they really wanted was to harass me and drive me away from my clients and make me make a decision to either comply with a court order or defy a court order and be loyal to my clients. Defying the court order would expose me to a criminal contempt of court charge. And the judge ended up charging me with criminal contempt of court for standing by my clients. And this was a misdemeanor, maximum sentence of 6 months in prison. The longest sentence any lawyer had ever gotten for this supposed crime was 2 months of home detention. I looked it up. He had me locked up the day he charged me at home with an ankle bracelet, locked up. I was stunned. Absolutely, I couldn't believe it. And he kept me, he and another judge, because there were 2 judges working it now, on home detention for 2 years and 2 months before I could even get a trial. So think about that. I spent over 4 times the maximum possible sentence detained before I could even get to a trial to contest the charges. So this completely, needless to say, altered my life and the life of my family. We had to adjust. This, by the way, this overlapped COVID. I was arrested on August 6, 2019. COVID began like February 2020, and this just kept going and going. There wasn't a day I didn't wake up where I didn't think I would get the ankle bracelet off by the next week. I mean, I had so much hope because every law compelled that ankle bracelet to come off. Like every principle of basic decency compelled that bracelet to come off. And you know, a lot of people are like, oh, you're home in detention. Let me come say, you must be so bored. Like, I would wake up every day making lists of shit I needed to do to get that ankle bracelet off and to help my clients and to move this case forward and to not be neutralized by these people, to not be driven into demoralization and depression, you know, which is what they wanted, to not have my family destroyed, which again is, or leave me, which I think is what they had in mind. Like we'll put so much pressure on these guys, everything's gonna just blow up in this guy's life. And I mean, for various reasons, we actually dealt with it really effectively and grew stronger from the experience. Now that's a whole other probably conversation, like how one deals with extreme adversity. I want to just acknowledge the many people in our criminal justice system and around the world who are unjustly detained or detained for years and years for political reasons. Lawyers in Turkey have been in jail for 20 plus years. I mean, you know the stories, okay? You know the stories of the history of this country. So I don't want to act like I had it that bad. I mean, I was home with my family. I couldn't leave for the most part. But this did happen, and this type of particular thing had never happened before. And that's important. Like when a country starts to lock up its poets or its human rights lawyers, something is really not right. And as a lawyer who's always believed in the rule of law and in the promise of the law, again, I might have been a little naive because I have kind of a different perspective on it now than I did when I started the case and even when I was litigating the case. But it was very disconcerting to me personally to sort of see what the system was doing and what the system was getting away with. And ultimately, when I said we gained strength, a friend of mine came over, a very good friend from San Francisco, to visit. I could get visitors when I was on detention. And she said, listen, man, she goes, what you got to do is build solidarity. You got to speak, get on Zoom, invite people over. She goes, whatever you do, don't take pharmaceuticals. She's like, no disrespect to those who do. There's place for that. But she's like, reach out, tell your story, and bring people into your home. And what ended up happening is the craziest story. For probably the first 6 or 8 months, I mean, I couldn't shake a stick at press coverage. I could not get anyone to write about it. And there was this woman who works for The Intercept. You guys know the online publication, The Intercept, Sharon Lerner, who actually lives out here in Brooklyn. And someone told her, and we knew someone in common, and she called me up, and she goes, can I come interview? I said, sure. And she came and did the first story about me. And they took a picture of me on my couch, and she basically wrote the story. It was kind of a little embarrassing because I kind of seemed down and out, frankly, the way she wrote the story. I didn't actually feel that way, but it just kind of came across but I realized it was actually the story that needed to be written. And that opened the floodgates, and suddenly I got, calls from all over, celebrities, presidential candidates, university presidents, human rights activists, neighbors, and I decided that I would accept any speaking engagement anyone gave me, from a kindergarten class to 9th graders at a high school to Harvard Law School. And I got invites from all three and many, many more. So over time, I also was active online. I hadn't really paid attention to Twitter. Then it was called Twitter or Instagram. But while this happened, I posted a lot about my journey, my story, what was happening, and I got a lot of support that way. And ultimately, I was able to build, until the point that Elon Musk bought Twitter, I had a 205,000 followers on Twitter. I had started just when I got detained. And I built up quite a following on Instagram too. And people are why do you spend, my son's Dad, why do you spend so much time posting? And I'm well, I do like to post, and I like my voice to be amplified. But there was actually a deeper reason that isn't necessarily that evident to people, which is if Chevron saw a lot of people supporting me with influence, that's a wall they really usually don't want to have to walk through to get to me. And I'm probably one of the few people who spends time on Instagram and X building audience for legal protection from an oil company, in addition to just wanting to communicate, Ultimately, I got my trial. I'm going to go a few more, and maybe we can open it up for a little combo, but I got my trial on the misdemeanor contempt charge. And I was fortunate enough to have Ron Kuby and Marty Garbus represent me. I know some of you folks probably, you don't know who Ron Kuby is? Yeah. beautiful man. Anyone know who Marty Garbus is? You know, he's a longtime civil rights lawyer. He represented Nelson Mandela and Václav Havel over the years. He's in his 90s now. And they represented me pro bono, and the judge denied me a jury. I knew the fix was in. But unlike the RICO trial, where it was very stressful, I was like, we're just going to enjoy this trial because, like, there's no hope I'm going to win this trial. Let's go just litigate the case. Put the judge on trial. In other words, throw stuff right back at her as much as we can to call out the hypocrisy and the lack of ethics of what was happening. There were a lot of journalists there, and ultimately, you know, she convicted me, but I felt like we won the trial because we used the mechanism of their show trial to show what they were doing in a really effective way, and I got built up. She still sentenced me, again, after I'd been over 4 times my max sentence at home, detained, she still sentenced me to 6 months in prison. On top of that, by the way, I said, how can you do that? I've already served my sentence 4 times. How can you not release me? She goes, Mr. Donziger, I can hear her voice. She wore, it was COVID, so she wore like this face mask, and her face mask was an American flag. Okay. And she said, because you're free. I'm like, what do you mean I'm free? I can't leave my house. She goes, you're free. You could be in jail. I could have put you in jail. I sent you home with conditions, with restrictions, but you're free. Restrictions being I was not free, basically, right? There's all this Orwellian Kafka stuff going on, you know, but we enjoyed confronting her and making her put statements like that on the record because it looked ridiculous, you know, to anyone watching it. So to make a very long story short, the whole basis for her pretrial detention of me was I was supposedly a risk of flight, like I was going to flee my wife and son, leave the country. She already took my passport and never come back. I was going to become basically an international fugitive because of a misdemeanor contempt charge, which of course they wanted me to do that. They wanted, oh, see, he fled, he's guilty. And it came to the point where I had to go to prison for my 6-month sentence. By the way, didn't want to go to prison. Now look, no one wants to go to prison. But I had another reason for not wanting to go to prison. I did not want to lose what was left of my liberty, obviously, but the other reason was I was really worried they would harm me in prison. Like, given the crazy shit that was happening in court through official channels, and also Jeffrey Epstein, I saw what happened to him, and I'm like, noted, okay? So I was doing all I could to avoid prison, not because I was inherently scared of prison or I didn't want to go. I was really worried I would get harmed in prison. I operated on the assumption that there was a risk of me getting killed in prison. And I think there was a risk. I mean, it didn't happen, obviously, but, you know, and it might have been 1%, it might have been 5%, it might have been, you know, whatever, but like it's not paranoia. Like, I had seen what was happening to me, and I had this valid concern, which of course I couldn't really share at the time with anybody, including my family, because everyone needed to be cool. And I wanted to manifest positivity. It turns out when I drove myself to prison, I went to Danbury up in Connecticut, it's like an hour-and-a-half drive from here. Remember, this was the guy who was risk of flight, drives himself to prison, walks up to the prison entry and like basically asked to be admitted. I asked to be admitted. I wanted to get it over. I realized I had to go to prison. That's sort of the, you know, for me to get through this, I had to like go to prison. They needed me in prison. They needed to have that. I knew my enemies needed to have that. So I'm like, I'll go to prison, and I went into prison, and like from the moment I walked in to prison, and they processed me in, the guards, you know, they look at the computer to see what you're in for. And they're like, they looked at me with this puzzled look, and they're like, why are you here? And I didn't really know how to explain it because I'd never seen a contempt of court conviction in a federal prison. because no one had ever been there for that. And I was the only person convicted of a misdemeanor in a 900-person prison. Everybody else was a felon. So these guys are sophisticated, and I realized there was kind of a territorial issue, like the prison staff and the Bureau of Prisons. I mean, I'm not defending them. They do a lot of not so good stuff, but they don't like to be told by judges what to do. Like, they're protective of their bureaucracy, and they did not like that this judge had sent a guy like me to their prison. They did not like that. They thought that was unfair. Funny, isn't it? People have humanity. I mean, I don't care how bad the shit people are doing sometimes. Like, there's some place in every soul, I believe this, maybe, I don't know if you guys believe this, but like, there's humanity in everyone's soul, okay? I'm not saying they're good people necessarily, but it's there somewhere. And it ended up that I quickly realized that they did not want me in their prison. And what ended up happening is, instead of 6 months, they sent me home after 6 weeks. Under Congress, because of COVID, had passed a law that if you were 60 or older, and I literally had just turned 60 the month before, and I didn't even know this, that you could go home to avoid getting COVID in prison after serving 25% of your sentence, as long as you serve the remaining 75% at home with an ankle bracelet under detention, home detention. So after 6 weeks, they let me go home, and I resumed my ankle bracelet detention until it ended on April 25th, 2022. After 993 days, I was detained as a human rights lawyer in the United States. To kind of close the loop on that, I just want to say this. About the case, it's still alive. They disbarred me without a hearing. I'm the first lawyer disbarred without a hearing, so I'm no longer a lawyer, but I maintain contact with my clients, and there are lawyers working on the enforcement of the judgment. I believe someday Chevron will be paying this judgment, whether I'm here or not, okay? Case is still alive. Number two is we're good. You know, I'm okay. I mean, I don't have my law license, and I'm kind of raising money constantly so we can live and I can do my work. I've sort of built I've sort of become the lawyer, even though I'm not a lawyer, I've sort of become the advocate I always envisioned, which is I'm really dealing with a number of human rights issues. You know, you mentioned Cop City. You know, I have probably a pretty particular perspective given my own personal experience that I'm often asked to share, and I speak a lot, and I'm writing a book, and I'm still posting, and there's all sorts of opportunities out there, particularly given the state of our country, for me to do work. And I'm sure for all of us to do work, okay? Because we all need to show agency and courage in these critical moments of history. So we're good, but obviously there's challenges. We all have challenges, but we have particular challenges because I can't really get a job. Because remember I told you I owe them a bunch of millions of dollars? Like, in theory, anything I earn, they could get. They've already taken a bunch of money from us through a garnishment theory based on money this judge ordered me to pay them. So getting back to the whole SLAPP concept, what they did to me, in addition to trying to criminalize me, in addition to locking me up unjustly. By the way, the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention ruled my detention was illegal. Okay, the United Nations ruled my detention was illegal. Not that I needed that to know it was illegal, but they did, okay? They created all sorts of conditions surrounding my life that kind of hover over my existence that probably you guys don't have to deal with. Like, if you want to get a new job, you're not thinking, well, I have to, like, where we're going to put the money, you know, et cetera. You know, if you want to travel, you don't have to, well, maybe you do now, but like, they don't, you know, I don't have a passport. They took my passport as a punishment for me not giving them my computer. So I haven't left the country for 6 years. And this is after I've been to Ecuador over 250 times over 20 years to deal with this case and to meet with these communities. So they've severed us from human contact. And I have to go through life dealing with this. And I don't know if it'll ever end. Actually, I will say I don't think it will fully ever end, because I think they designed the whole, I would call the encumbrances that hover over my existence. They designed it to last and to sort of not be super evident to the naked eye, and to be flexible enough to be activated if they need to, should I misbehave, and somehow crank up some litigation or get lawyers to crank up some litigation against them that would force them to pay the $10 billion judgment they owe to these communities for the cleanup, And I'll say that what happened to me, there's bad stuff that's happened. There's been other RICO cases, other attacks on the rule of law that, people are murdered in this country by police constantly over our history. Look at the genocide of indigenous. You know the history, okay? But what was so unusual was doing it to a human rights lawyer with my background, who had won this kind of case. That's sort of the model, is it not, for what we're hearing out of the White House right now, right? And, it's what the Attorney General of Georgia did to all the Cop City protesters. By the way, that RICO case has been dismissed. 61 people had to live 2.5 years with that shit hanging over their head. Totally bogus case. I could tell from the get-go that was a bogus case. Designed to weaponize the law to punish advocacy, to punish social justice advocates for speaking out in a way that was totally protected by the Constitution. That's what that case was. Will there be any repercussions for the person behind that case? I think his name is, the governor's Brian Kemp. The Attorney General of Georgia's last name is Carr. I think it's Chris Carr. So as we march through life and move through space, it's important to remember that if you become what I would call too effective, they have these weapons that can be deployed that are very sophisticated. And it's important that we, on the progressive left, I don't mean to presume anyone's politics here, but if you do this kind of work, that we be fully cognizant of their power, the tools they use, and to also understand there is a model to deal with it, which I believe I have at least somewhat successfully employed in my life. When we got sued for $60 billion, I say we because, I have a family. And when they started to attack us, they got all these legal reporters to basically write articles about how this famous case in Ecuador was all a bunch of BS and the lawyer's a criminal. I'd been working on this for 20 years at that time. I had gotten quite a bit of attention. So they tried to act like, oh my God, there's this scandal. That case, that guy. And, two things, and I'll leave you with this. My wife, the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial when they first sued me called Amazon Swindle. I don't know how many of you read the Wall Street Journal. It used to be a more influential newspaper, in 2010 than it is now. You're not really a plaintiff's lawyer of any ilk unless you've been criticized in the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, but I didn't know that. And they wrote this awful, awful editorial about me. And, everyone calls you up, your friends, your family, my wife's parents, my in-laws, what did Stephen do down? What did he really do down there? All these years he was going to Ecuador. What was he doing? And my wife said, do you think you'll ever get your name back? Because I don't think you realize how much we rely on, how much we derive in terms of our self-esteem from our reputations until you lose it, okay? And my response was, I don't think I'll ever get my name back. because it was like a nuclear arms race between like the United States and like Ecuador. Like we had no weapons. They had all the money. And I said, but one thing we will do is we will get our truth out there to the best of our ability at all times. So if people Google the case, hopefully they'll not just see this false narrative, but they'll see my narrative. And at a minimum, they'll be like, I wonder who's right and who's wrong. Most people don't trust oil companies. So I knew if we could maintain the vibrancy of our truth, that we could get through this, okay? And we have, especially over time as they overreached, in my opinion, and they built up my platform by locking me up. So now people know me much more than they used to know me. Probably why some of you are here today. And then the second thing I told my wife, since our son was 13 years old when they locked me up with an ankle bracelet, it's sort of hard to explain to your kid at that age. Our son was kind and like incredibly gracious about the whole thing all the way through, but no doubt he suffered a lot of hurt. And my wife Laura and I'm like, what we're not going to do is let them steal our happiness. Okay, we're going to not let a trauma turn into a pathology in our house. Not going to let it happen. And for the most part, we didn't. Like, we were really good at separating the professional, as unpleasant as that part of it was, from the personal, as pleasant as that was. So there are techniques that we need to develop, but we can all develop. Many of us probably have already, but I'm just saying there are techniques that can be used if this shit goes down, so they don't win. So I think I'll stop there.